Welcome to this week's installment of Today and Tomorrow in Scottsdale with Don Henniger. I'm Don, and joining me as always is my friend and fellow podcast journalist, Kevin Maxwell.
Hi, thanks for calling me a journalist.
I think you qualify.
That's a badge of honor. Thank you.
We're going to see if our guest agrees with us, people. By the time we're done, we'll see what kind of questions you ask. How's that sound?
You guys are the real deals.
Yeah, I don't know what the real deal is, but we have one heck of a journalist with us today that has an amazing career that we're going to talk about. His name is David Ariosto, and over the past 20 years, he's worked as a journalist, an editor, an executive, an author in more than 50 countries. Between 2009 and 2010, he was based in Havana, Cuba for CNN. From there, he moved to New York City and worked as an editor at CNN Digital. There, he reported from across the globe, including Russia, Venezuela, Haiti, Eastern Europe, and the high Arctic. The high Arctic, what was that all about, David?
There's a lot to that.
If I got that all right, then that's a heck of a roadmap we just put out there, right?
Yeah.
We got frequent fire miles coming out of your ears probably, right? By the way, along the way, he wrote a fascinating book. This is Cuba, an American journalist under Castro's shadow. Kevin and I both read that book. Yep. We were kind of blown away by it. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you today, David. Not to mention the fact that you live in Scottsdale. You've got an amazing career. You've been teaching at the Cronkite Journalism School at ASU. So you're a part of our community. And we're just thrilled to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I appreciate you having me. It's nice to hear badge of honor attributed to journalism. You wonder these days how people view it.
We're going to have you on for another podcast to talk about that subject because we could go a long time on that one, couldn't we? That's for sure. But so your book in Cuba I thought was fascinating and took us behind the scenes and things that we never would have known before without you being feet on the ground there. But so let's start talking about that a little bit. You were sent there by CNN for a 2-year assignment to cover the country, right?
Yeah, based in Havana.
So at what point along that journey, along the way, were you inspired to think about writing a book?
You know, I had this sort of great mentor named Richard Griffiths at CNN in Atlanta, and he gave me some of the best advice I could have gotten. He said, before all this seems normal, before it seems humdrum, write all your observations down the first 6 months. Just everything that seems weird or different or strange is all going to seem normal to you in about 6 months to a year. So write all those observations down, keep a journal. And, you could use it later for something. And I true to his word, I did that. And so, every night after work, I'd go to this little paladar, which is this little Cuban restaurant near my house. And I just would scratch out different observations and notes, not really having any sense of where it was going, just observations. And, you start to pick up things when you're sort of this lone American sitting at a table, particularly in a place that was frequented by Cuban officials, like people like Ricardo Alarcón and others. You just start to pick up these little, sometimes nonverbal cues about what's happening. And, at a place like that, you might see, Miami businessmen interacting with Cuban officials, individuals that you would never see interacting in the normal world, or all of a sudden having these sort of backroom conversations over cohibas and rum. So, that was sort of the beginnings of it, this sort of cloak and dagger world that I inherited.
At what point did the light go on that you said to yourself during that process? By the way, I think that process is fascinating.
Yeah.
Basic reporting stuff, when you think about it, writing down details and observations and journaling. At what point along that process did the light go on and said, I got a book here?
I kind of always had in the back of my mind I wanted to do something. There's this sort of Graham Greene fantasy of any American or man in Havana that goes down to Cuba and, writes these stories. And I think
Hemingway-esque, right?
Yeah. and to be honest, it was kind of like calling my own BS in some ways. Like I was a gringo that was heading down to Cuba, and I was in some ways, it was kind of, this trope of like this American who was interested in old cars and cigars and, black and white films of Kennedy and Castro and that whole Cold War mystique. And Cuba was this vestige of this. And you go to work every day in like a 56 Chevy and it felt like this time capsule place. And so that didn't seem like the story that I wanted to tell after I was living there for a while. It just like you start to scratch beneath the surface. And Cuba is those things, but it's so much more than that. And I lived there for about 2 years, but then I kept going back every year for different organizations, National Geographic and others. And, during that time, the détente between Cuba and the United States took place under Barack Obama. And so it seemed like there's a natural arc to my own time there. So a book seemed of the making.
Good timing all the way around, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So give us a little summary of the book.
Well, I showed up in Havana, like your sort of quintessential gringo who spoke kind of broken Spanish. You know, I'd lived and worked in Mexico and Costa Rica and a few other places in Panama before, but you know, Cuban Spanish has its own flair, right? And it was a learning curve. I lived in the Hotel Nacional, which is sort of this main hotel. A place that was the former locale of the Havana Conference, where these top mob bosses and mafiosos pre 1959 revolution had met at the Havana Conference to kind of divide up territory in the United States in terms of the different mob groups in the U.S. And so it had this sort of legacy component to these gold frame pictures you'd walk past of people like Louis Armstrong and Frank Sinatra and just all these sort of luminaries of the past. And you'd walk into the courtyard and they'd be playing Buena Vista Social Club, which before I lived there, I loved that group. And after hearing it a million times in that hotel and elsewhere, you start to lose its flavor.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just it was sort of a trying to figure out what my take was on that, but while also trying to get a sense of how the CNN bureau operated, because it was under surveillance by the Cuban authorities. And, we weren't restricted from what we could report, but there were consequences to reporting on dissidents. So, one of my first stories out of the gate was the roughing up of a Cuban dissident named Ioani Sanchez. And I visited her house, her apartment, and in Vedado, I believe. And she had some bruises on her arms, and so I reported it. And the Cuban government didn't offer comment, and it's hard. I think that's part of the problem. It's really hard because traditionally it's gotten a little bit more transparent recently, but traditionally it's just a very opaque government. They don't offer very much, although they did recently. I know you want to talk about the Havana syndrome stuff. They did offer some of their officials to talk about that, which is sort of a sea change. But after that, there was threats of not renewing the visa, and there's always sort of this specter of surveillance and the individuals that you meet. I can be funny, but I'm not that funny, right? With women laughing at your jokes and that sort of thing. And so there's the Cuban spy angle. There's the discrepancy in income. Cubans were making $20 a month. Yeah. While I was making an American salary down there. And so, you wonder, are my interactions genuine? Because I think there was a form that we had to sign when we first established that bureau, and then all subsequent journalists and the Cuban government made you sign a form that asks you if you are a journalist or other form of counter-revolutionary.
Other form?
Yeah.
So we're going to put that in that category?
Yeah,
Is that
exactly.
right?
I wish I saved that and just frame it on my wall.
That's pretty cool.
But gives you an idea of how they thought of us.
Yeah. Did you ever feel threatened by government watchdogs or government sort of, not the spies, but did you ever fear the interference or some pressure?
Yeah, all the time. All the time. I wouldn't say fear, but you feel the pressure, right? It wasn't a Russia. It wasn't a China. It wasn't like you wouldn't experience the kind of violence that you'd see in places like Afghanistan or Honduras or something to that effect, where it's quite just dangerous going out. In a place like Cuba, it was actually quite safe to walk on the streets at night and that sort of thing. But there was an expectation that your phones were tapped, your emails were read, the neighbors were informing on you, the individuals who worked in your office were also informing on you because, while there were American journalists working there, the staff were Cuban employees. And they were our friends, but they were also Cuban employees and they had to file their reports. And so, a little bit of a tacit agreement was struck in terms of, not making them privy to some of the reports that we're doing, particularly within the dissident community, and not putting them in that kind of position. But that was always in the back of your mind. You had to be sort of careful about what conversations you had, and so that sense of privacy. And I think everybody needs a degree of privacy, no matter what you're doing. You need a moment that you kind of know is your own. And if you think that different parts of your house are bugged and I know there's also like a little bit of a paranoia. So sometimes you might suppose something that is not. But Cuban intelligence is renowned. I mean, it's known to punch well above its weight. Infiltrated the National Security Council, some of the highest levels of U.S. government. So, they put their best people on that because they consider the United States an existential threat. Or at least I don't want to say they used to, because it was a different dynamic under the Castro government as what is now with Diaz-Canel, but it's still there. It's still that same mindset is there, and that aging gerontocracy of the 80-year-olds and some of them approaching 90-year-olds individuals in government still harken back to those old days of revolution that they can remember Castro giving those 7-hour speeches in speeches in the Plaza de Revolucion. So,
Ouch. Yeah.
Wow. What I liked about the book, my favorite part, is what I liked about it, it's not necessarily a politics book. It's not a book about foreign policy necessarily, but I like how you'll be talking to a character, the real people though, but you'll be talking to somebody and all of a sudden you'll go into 20 pages about the underground black market economy. And then a few chapters later, you're talking to somebody and then you go into the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, give us a really good deep background on that event. Yeah. You talk about the Kennedy assassination a little bit and gave us some good insights on that. I just liked how you kind of went off these little tangents and give us little nuggets of history, which was really, really good.
I appreciate that. I tend to think people, they want to be informed, but they don't want a sort of a history lesson in the same kind of context, right? Yeah. You trick people to learn about what the context is of the scene by having these great characters.
You're telling great stories, and that keeps our attention.
Right.
And that's what a good journalist does, man. Be able to talk about tough issues and with good stories around the side. I agree, Kevin. That made the book very readable.
I didn't know about, for example, I didn't know about everybody knows what the Bay of Pigs invasion is, right? But I didn't know it was the worst kept secret in Cuba, and they knew they were coming, right? And that they had some. And did the Cuban government have some people actually implanted in the invading force? You said
allegedly, yes.
Yeah,
they did.
that's in that. That's people right in there.
I know, that's crazy,
right?
Yeah, for sure.
So,
and a lot of that structure it dates back to the old Soviet structure that they have. A lot of that apparatus was informed by some of those meetings in the former Yugoslavia with top Soviet personnel. You see it in their sports teams. A lot of the training that Cuban boxers have is mimics some of that old Soviet style. So you have that Caribbean athleticism with the old Soviet structure, and that's why you have some of the best athletes in Cuban boxers and baseball, at least baseball. It used to be baseball, not so much anymore.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Are there some people or stories that kind of stick out in your mind that you think about a lot and that you've kept in your heart and soul since your experiences there?
Oh man, there's so many. There's so many. It's at one point I shared the house with. I initially had the house by myself when I finally moved in, and it was funny talking to neighbors about that house because it was just like this beautifully ornate, painted in these vibrant Cuban colors. And when I arrived, none of that was true. It was all just just plain white. And one, it turns out it was kind of a jobs program. They had to paint these things for the Cuban personnel there. But two, every item had been snatched. So there was.
I think your sink got stolen.
Oh, yeah. But there was no.
That's right. That's right.
Remember that?
Yeah, the sink. There was no light. Well, the sink was there actually, right?
Okay.
So the light bulbs were gone. the shower curtains were gone. The shower rods were gone. And these things, that seems like an annoyance here. You just run out to Home Depot and get it. There, you could spend all week, all month looking for something like that, and just the stores don't have it. And typically you find a way by going to the black market in a way. So in many ways, communism is sort of underground capitalism in a way. People tend to find a way to exchange goods and services, and they just they either do it with the tacit approval of the government or not.
Human beings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy what comes together. That was funny. And how long would it take to wait for just ordering basic supplies?
Yeah.
For weeks where we're going to go out, like you say, to Home Depot and buy it tomorrow or tonight, and you got to wait for weeks for it to show up?
Yeah. That sink, though, was wild. Leaving in the morning and having a bathroom sink and coming back and having it being removed and then calling the minder that I had and him just not even denying it. He just said, "Oh, yeah, we took it." And it's it was almost just what are you going to do about it?
I might need it. Yeah. You come to think of it, Yeah, a sink doesn't come with a house.
Yeah. Another thing I found surprising was you talked a little bit about the evolving pharmaceutical market there, or pharmaceutical industry there, how they were remarkably successful in some anti-cancer type medication, stuff like that. That's kind of interesting that they would be able to thrive in that kind of environment.
It's interesting. It kind of turns on its head a little bit about how we think about innovation. And traditionally, I think in Western markets have always been a bastion for innovation, right? Private sector markets breed innovation, breed new technologies. But there's certain things, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector, that just don't bring in a lot of money and are just simply not, they're not invested in. And so things like curing blindness, certain types of cancers. There's a couple different lists that you can kind of look at that are really difficult problems for a small segment of the population, and therefore it's not a big market, but they're pernicious issues. And the Cubans, in some ways, because they were looking to sort of establish themselves as ways to kind of thumb their nose at the Yankee, quote unquote Yankee capitalists in the North. They developed these things in different ways, but I remember hearing Fidel Castro interviewed about this, and looking at profit and loss margins, and he's like, "Well, what is that? We're just trying to solve this." Right. And so they would just, he would just throw money at a problem until he could resolve it. And so it's interesting. Cuba is a textured story in the sense that certainly communism created a lot of hardship, and a lot of people were thrown into jails, and the exile stories are real, and losing property is real, and the firing squads, at least in those early days, were real. So it's not to minimize at all those tragic stories. But there are these other things that the emphasis on community health care and the different successes they've had, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector. I got a chance to interview a few folks on the U.S. side in places like Baltimore, certainly in New York. Former Governor Andrew Cuomo was like in direct partnerships with the Cubans following the détente with the U.S. in 2014 about some joint scientific research when it came to cancer research that the Cubans had been pioneering. So it's not a cut and dry story, right? I always find myself just sort of like, people who say Cuba is hell on earth, that's not true. And Cuba who say Cuba is this utopia, well, that's not true either, right? So
it's never cut and dry, is it? Yeah. So what do you think about the future of Cuba? What's your outlook in terms of Cuba's future?
It's interesting. I think it was Brent Scowcroft that said something to the effect that Cuba is not a foreign policy issue, it's a domestic one, right? And for the longest period of time, Cuba there was no real movement made in Cuba because of acts like the Helms-Burton Act and others within the embargo that, you were risking a significant voting bloc in a key swing state of Florida by doing anything. Florida's kind of in the red camp now. So it's not as much in play anymore. So that in some ways opens the door, but in reality, like it's just not much of a priority for the U.S. There was a recent meeting by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce down in Cuba, I think just like last week or 2 weeks ago. Actually, no, that was a while back. But there was the business community wants Cuba open because Cuba imports like 60 to 70% of its food.
Great market.
It's a great market, and that's an island of 11 million people. They all have direct ties, not all, but many of them have direct ties to the United States, in New Jersey, in Florida, in New York, and and pick a number of different states. So there's a natural market there, and that embargo is like Swiss cheese, right? It can't come this way, but it can go that way. So a lot of our agricultural exports do go there, although they have been dropping, and principally they've been dropping because Cuba is cash strapped. They just don't have a lot of money these days. The pandemic hit them hard in terms of one of their biggest cash cows is tourism. And people just stopped traveling during the pandemic. And I don't think they've really ever recovered from that.
That's interesting. Yeah. So you've been through over 50 countries in your career. And now you live in Scottsdale. How'd that happen?
Well, I had a kid, decided that, I wanted to be a really present father, and, the days of sort of dancing around to different countries and going to war zones, and it just, those are kind of behind me, although I'm still pursuing this next book. So that's, I still scratch that itch in some ways, but this just seemed like Scottsdale just seemed like a really good place to raise a kid. And, we go outdoors and do rock climbing and hiking and all that stuff. So, I love that.
How does Scottsdale show up on your map?
Or
Arizona for that matter.
Yeah, no, I mean, I got an opportunity. I mean, we originally moved out here for my ex-wife's job, and I ended up teaching at ASU at the Cronkite School.
Sure.
And we were doing we actually did a documentary with them. It was a student-led documentary focused on solutions on youth suicide. Wow. So it was a really interesting project in the context that, oftentimes you hear that topic and it's a very sad story. And it always is a sad story, but it's almost like you've addressed a problem and then you sort of leave it there. But this project was specifically oriented towards what moves the needle, like what solutions can be found, and everything from just like, those pop pill, I forget what you call them, but if you have to like physically pop the pills out of the container, as opposed to just pour them out,
right?
That simple process just sometimes slows because it takes longer to pop these things out, and somebody's just thinking like, maybe I don't want to do this, and then it's
really
and there's a lot of
the packaging can be a deterrent to suicide.
Apparently.
Wow. Think about it. It makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Right? Yeah.
That's why firearms, suicide by firearm is such a devastating thing because it's so quick.
Yeah.
Right. Because if you're taking pills, then like there's a little bit of a grace period. But if you suicide by firearm, there's usually no coming back from that. Or if there is, it's devastating. In that kind of context.
Yeah, so. For sure. So you mentioned a new book, and Kevin, you've been digging into that book too. Talk a little bit about what your new book is.
Yeah.
It's a book centered on for lack of a better term, the second great space race. So, as I'm sure people have paid attention to recently, there's just been a renewed push into space, and there's a recent landing on the moon by a company called Intuitive Machines, and that's a company I've been profiling for the last couple years. I've been down at their factory almost 3 years ago now, and I was at Cape Canaveral for that launch. I was in mission control. I got a chance to sort of see what it took to land on the moon. There's a lot of exclusive material that's going to come in out of that. Wow. It's a private company, so a lot of the stuff, it's unlike NASA. You don't. Sometimes you just have to be there to see how they're doing it. But I also went to different countries around the world. I got a chance to go to CERN and in Switzerland and see some of the particle physics that they're doing there, some of the Eastern competitors as well. I was down in Argentina about 2 years ago in a partnership with the Chinese. The Chinese military had built a deep space station in Patagonia. So I visited that and got a chance to speak with the engineers and the architects who built this thing. And it all kind of centers around maybe three different big parts. One is like the commercial aspect of space and this growing new space that we're seeing. Two is like the international competition between all these different players. It's no longer just the Soviets and the U.S. It's the U.S. and the Chinese and ESA being the Europeans and Japan and North and South Korea and Iran and Israel and Luxembourg and all these players that you probably wouldn't have thought of but are doing just amazing things. And then the last is something that, for all those like sci-fi nerds out there like myself, I kind of referring to this, the high technological aspects and just sort of these paradigm shifting technologies that you might have read about in, Arthur C. Clarke, if you can remember those books from back then and some more recent ones like David Brin and others who are just, they're scientists at their core. Some of them are physicists, but they kind of take the next step, the logical next step of what could be achieved. And, when you think about what could be achieved, chances are there's probably somebody funding it. Yeah. And that's true with DARPA and with the Pentagon. And there's a lot of money being spent on exploratory technologies that, would peel your eyelids back if you had time to actually dig into it. So that's what I'm working on.
And how close are you?
Two-thirds of the way done.
Good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Good deal. Looking forward to that.
You got a name for it yet?
I do. I can't say it yet. I can't say it yet.
You're gonna have to come back on when this thing gets published. So one, we know the books we can get it, and two, we can tell people about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about going back to the Cuba thing a little bit. Talk about the Black Spring a little bit.
Oh yeah,
you were down there when that was going on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, no, it was so the Black Spring was before my time, but the release of political prisoners started to happen during my time. So I was reporting during the largest release of political prisoners in the country's like more modern history, and part of that was oriented towards what seemed to be the beginnings of détente. A détente that was brokered, ironically, by the Catholic Church, an individual by the name of Jaime Ortega, who secretly traveled to D.C. under the auspices of an invitation with Georgetown University, pretending to kind of that was his reason, and met with Barack Obama in the White House, and Ben Rhodes and Carlos Zuniga. But there was another aspect to it that I think sometimes gets missed a little bit, in the sense that Raul Castro was always considered much more of a pragmatist than his brother. They kind of considered that, analysts I've talked to often to describe that as almost like the perfect dictatorship. And I use the term perfect not to indicate good by any stretch, right, but effective in that sense. But whereas Fidel was this larger than life figure, this bombastic orator who would give 7-hour speeches in the plaza, and Raul was the guy behind the scenes, like counting the beans, right? And he was just like making sure the trains ran on time. And the fact that Cuba was an island and they can control its borders a little bit better, the fact that they had this yin and yang in the top. But with regard to the Black Spring, I really do believe that at some point, Raul just decided that it made sense to let a little steam out of the kettle.
Right.
And the joke, a bit of a dark joke, but it was kind of a catch and release program. So they'd let them go, and some of them would go off to Spain and somewhere else, and some of them would just be picked right back up again a couple of weeks later. So they got the headline of the dissidents being released, but then they were back in jail.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, a little PR thing going on there.
A little bit, yeah.
Funny.
A lot of it was that. It was just managing the message. I mean, that the Castro brothers were masters at managing the message. I mean, what they did to the New York Times, however many years ago, sort of duping. It was Hubert Humphrey, I believe his name was. I can't remember now. Yeah. It's been a while. Yeah. Into thinking that the guerrilla movement that Castro's band was bigger than it was, and that then filtered down to Havana, and in and of itself was a galvanized movement for the revolution. So, the role of the media has always been. We've always been used.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
that continues today.
Yeah.
In every way, and there's just many more platforms for use now too, right?
Yeah.
What a fascinating story. Are you doing some freelance work now? Is that what you?
Yeah.
So staying busy with the journalism still.
Yeah. Still doing that. I've been writing for number of different space trade magazines.
That's fantastic.
Like Electronic Engineering Times and others. It helps me get into a little bit more the nitty gritty details of the rocket scientists, frankly.
Kidding. So, what a career. That's fascinating.
Well,
what a career, what a story.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You'd be able to pivot from one industry like that. I mean,
amazing.
Just two books can't be further apart from each other in subject matter, but the first one was really excellently written. I'm sure the second was going to be too. So I think you have a great subject matter.
That's the fun of it. I think the idea to be able just to pivot and go to different places is that's the fun of journalism.
So the book was This is Cuba, an American Journalist Under Castro's Shadow. Kevin and I both recommend reading. It's really good to read, and we're just going to have you on next time when your next book comes out, man.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Definitely. So stay in touch with us for that. But Kevin, another great show, another great Scottsdale resident doing cool things here.
Absolutely.
Man.
We have there's talent amongst us, even though we may not be that familiar, but he's right here, man. He's
right
in our
here,
community.
and we love telling the story. So David, what a pleasure it was getting to know you, getting a chance to share your story with our listeners, and just getting a chance to plug in and check in with the career that you've had, with a lot more still to come. We can't wait to catch up with you some more in the future.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You bet. And thanks to all of our listeners. See you next week for our latest edition of Today and Tomorrow in Scottsdale.